Liam's scream was so loud that the brush slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the pavement. I was selling paintings on the sidewalk that afternoon, desperate and honestly running on fumes. My art degree had turned out to be pretty useless, at least according to every gallery that had rejected my portfolio in the past 6 months. The rent notice had gone from yellow to red, and my landlord's patience had officially expired. I was 1 week away from being homeless, which is why I was out here, hoping someone would buy a sunset landscape for $50. But when I turned around, I saw a small boy crouched behind my canvas display, trembling like he was being hunted. "Please, mister." His voice cracked with genuine fear. "Don't let her take me." My heart sank. This kid was maybe 7 years old, with messy dark hair and eyes that held way too much terror for someone his age. His scent hit me a second later, young, obviously too young to have presented yet, but underneath that clean child smell was something else. Fear. Pure, primal omega fear. I'm an omega myself. 24 years old, unpresented until I was 19, late bloomer, my mother called it, and I knew that scent intimately. The kind of fear that comes when something inside you recognizes a predator. That's when a tall figure approached, moving with the kind of controlled urgency that comes from someone used to being in charge. He wore a black turtleneck despite the warm weather, and his sharp jawline was set in a tense expression. His dark brown eyes looked serious but exhausted, like he'd been awake for 3 days straight. Everything about his body language screamed frustration mixed with concern. And his scent, God, his scent hit me like a physical force. Alpha. Strong alpha. The kind of alpha whose presence made omegas instinctively want to either submit or run. His pheromones were carefully controlled, restrained in a way that suggested he was used to hiding his true nature in professional settings. But I could still smell it underneath. Wood smoke and leather and something darker, something that made my hindbrain sit up and pay attention. Liam. His voice was measured but strained. "We've been over this, buddy. Come on." The boy Liam, apparently, grabbed my arm from behind the canvas, his tiny fingers digging into my sleeve with surprising strength. A few feet away, a woman stood, tapping her heel impatiently. But wait, no. Not a woman. I'd made an assumption based on appearance, but the scent was wrong. Too sharp. Too controlled. This was an alpha male, dressed in designer clothes with perfectly styled hair, and an expression that made it clear he'd rather be anywhere else. His features were delicate, almost pretty, but his jaw was too strong, his shoulders too broad beneath that expensive blazer. "Julian, we're already running late," he snapped, his voice carrying an alpha command that made my omega hindbrain bristle. "The charity gala starts in an hour, and we haven't even left yet." Julian. So that was the father's name. Instead of looking at his son, Julian turned his attention to me, studying my face carefully like he was trying to read something written there. "You're an artist." It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. "Yes," I answered cautiously, unsure where this was going. "Do you take private commissions?" "Sometimes, but I mostly do these street sales because..." "How much would you charge for a week's worth of work?" "Corporate office pieces. Nothing too elaborate." He was all business now, cutting straight to the point. I was completely thrown off. "Sir, I usually don't do that kind of work on such short notice." "Name a number." My brain scrambled to calculate rent, food, and basic survival. 1,500. Done. He pulled out his phone, already typing. "But there's a condition." He gestured toward Liam, who was still pressed against my leg. "Liam loves art. He refuses to talk to his tutors, won't participate in any activities we've tried. But look at him right now." Julian pointed at my canvas, where Liam's eyes were fixed on a sunset painting, oranges and purples blending together in a way that had taken me hours to get right. "You want me to teach him art?" I asked slowly, making sure I understood. "Trial basis. 1 week. If he's comfortable with you by the end of it, we'll discuss a longer arrangement." Julian's tone was practical, not impulsive like I'd initially thought. "I'm stuck at the office constantly. Childcare agencies have it worked out, and he won't cooperate with anyone we've hired so far. But look at him right now." He's engaged. I glanced down. Liam was still holding on to me, but his eyes were locked on my painting with a kind of wonder that made my chest tighten. The blonde alpha Marcus, I'd learn later, stepped forward with an incredulous expression. Julian, this is absurd. We can't just hire some random Omega off the street. He's not random, Marcus. He's a professional artist. Julian's tone left no room for argument. And this is for Liam, not for us. Marcus's jaw clenched, but he went silent. His alpha pheromones spiked for just a moment, aggression, territoriality, before he forced them back down. 1 week, Julian repeated, looking directly at me. A trial period. If it works out, we'll negotiate terms properly. Does that sound fair to you? My rent was overdue. Bills were piling up on my kitchen counter. And this kid, this scared little boy, was looking at me like I was some kind of lifeline he desperately needed. Fair, I finally said. Julian pulled out a business card, embossed and heavy, the kind that announced importance before you even read the name. Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. The address is on there. He started to turn away, but Liam grabbed my hand with both of his. You'll come, right? Promise. My throat felt tight. Yes, Liam. I promise. I'll be there. Julian gave me one last look before leaving, something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Assessment, maybe, or caution. But there was something else underneath. Relief, perhaps. And something that looked almost like curiosity. After they drove away in a car that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years, I stood there on the sidewalk, holding that business card, wondering what exactly I'd just agreed to. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I packed up my paintings early, too distracted to focus on sales anyway. Back in my tiny apartment, I looked up Julian's company online. Hawthorne Industries. Major corporate player. Involved in tech acquisitions and commercial real estate. And Julian Hawthorne himself was the EO, an alpha whose net worth was listed in the hundreds of millions, whose face had graced magazine covers, whose name was whispered in business circles with a mixture of respect and fear. I just agreed to teach art to the son of one of the richest alphas in the city. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying Liam's terrified face, the way he clung to me like I was the only safe thing in his world. And Julian's exhausted eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he looked at his son with a mixture of love and helplessness. I'd taken this job because I needed the money. Desperately. But something told me this was about to become much more complicated than a simple week-long art tutorial. The next morning, I woke up early and sorted through my art supplies, packing things that would be appropriate for a 7-year-old. Basic paints, brushes of different sizes, sketch pads, colored pencils. I wanted to be prepared to make a good impression. As I drove toward the address on the card, my anxiety grew with every mile. The neighborhood changed gradually, houses getting larger and farther apart, until I was in an area where properties were gated and security cameras were visible on every corner. When I finally pulled up to the address, I had to stop and double-check that I'd read it correctly. This wasn't just a house. It was practically an estate. I sat in my car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, asking myself if I was really ready for whatever waited beyond those gates. But I'd made a promise to Liam, and somehow that felt more important than anything else. I took a deep breath, grabbed my bag of art supplies, and stepped out of the car. The house was intimidating in a way I hadn't expected. Not flashy or ostentatious, but quietly powerful. High walls surrounded the property, topped with what looked like sophisticated security systems. The gate itself was solid black iron, and when I pressed the intercom button, I half expected to be turned away. A voice came through, professional and impersonal. State your name and business. I'm here to see Liam. Julian Hawthorne hired me yesterday. I'm the art instructor. There was a pause, probably while someone verified my story. And then the gate began to swing open with a mechanical hum. The driveway was long enough that I started second-guessing my decision to walk instead of driving through. Landscaping on both sides was immaculate, not a single leaf out of place, everything trimmed and maintained with obvious care and expense. The house itself was all modern architecture, glass and steel construction that probably looked stunning in architectural magazines but felt cold in person. When I reached the front door, it opened before I could knock. A middle-aged beta woman with kind eyes and a housekeeper's uniform greeted me with a slight smile. "You must be the art teacher. Mr. Hawthorne is in a conference call, but Liam's been waiting for you upstairs. Second door on the right." I thanked her and stepped inside. The interior matched the exterior perfectly. Minimalist furniture, white walls, expensive-looking art pieces that were technically impressive but emotionally distant. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed how quiet everything was. No television sounds, no music, no signs of normal household chaos. It felt more like a museum than a home where a child lived. And the scents were deliberately neutralized. Air filtration systems designed to remove pheromones, to keep the environment sterile and professional. I'd heard about wealthy alphas doing that, erasing any trace of omega influence from their spaces. Liam's door was slightly ajar. I knocked gently and pushed it open, and the contrast nearly made me laugh. This room was everything the rest of the house wasn't. Toys scattered across the floor. Drawings covering the walls, taped up haphazardly with clear tape that was starting to peel. In the corner sat a small easel, with dried paint crusted on the legs. "You came." Liam practically jumped when he saw me, his whole face lighting up. "I thought maybe you wouldn't. I made you a promise," I said, stepping inside and setting down my supply bag. "Are these your drawings?" He nodded, suddenly shy. "My dad says they're too messy. That's why they're only in my room." I walked over to examine one more closely. It showed a house with stick figures and a large tree, drawn with more care than the rest. The proportions were off, and the colors bled together in places, but there was genuine emotion in it. "This isn't messy, Liam. It's honest. Real art is supposed to be messy sometimes. That's what makes it authentic." His eyes went wide, like I just told him something revolutionary. We sat down on the floor together, and I started unpacking supplies. Liam was surprisingly focused once we got started, his tongue poking out slightly when he concentrated, exactly the way I used to do when I was his age. "This tree," he said while adding green paint to his paper, "is the one from the park near here." "You like parks?" "Yeah, but we never go anymore. Dad's always working." "Any?" Liam paused, clearly talking about Marcus but not wanting to say his name. "He says parks are dirty and full of germs." My chest tightened. This kid was essentially locked in a beautiful cage. The door opened suddenly, and Julian walked in. He'd removed his jacket and loosened his tie, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It was the first time I'd seen him looking even slightly casual. And without the professional restraint, his alpha scent was more present. Wood smoke and leather, yes, but underneath that was something warmer. Cedar, maybe. And something else, something that made my omega instincts sit up and take notice. He was tall. I hadn't fully registered that yesterday. Broad-shouldered, with a kind of build that came from disciplined exercise rather than gym vanity. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it. And his eyes, those dark brown eyes that had looked so exhausted yesterday, were currently fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "How are things going?" he asked carefully, like he was afraid of the answer. "Really well," I answered honestly. "Liam's got natural talent. He just needs encouragement." Julian's expression softened for just a moment. He knelt down beside Liam's painting, studying the green tree, taking shape. "Is that the park with the big oak tree?" Liam nodded eagerly, hope filling his eyes. "We'll go this weekend," Julian said suddenly, surprising even himself, it seemed. "I promise." "We will." Liam's entire face transformed with joy, and in that moment I could see how hard Julian was trying. He wasn't perfect at this, but he was genuinely trying to connect with his son. "Thank you," Julian said quietly after standing up, directing the words at me. "For coming today. For understanding what he needs. You don't need to thank me for doing my job. Actually, I do. The last 3 tutors we hired quit after a single day. One didn't even make it through the first hour. That explained the desperation yesterday. Liam isn't difficult, I said, glancing at the boy, who was now completely absorbed in his painting. He's just lonely. Kids act out when they're not getting what they need emotionally. Julian's jaw tightened, and I realized I'd touched a nerve. I know that. Believe me, I know. He paused, running a hand through his hair. But there's a corporate restructuring happening. Board meetings every single day. And this merger with Marcus's father's company. He stopped himself. Sorry. You're here for Liam, not to listen to my problems. I'm here for the weak, I reminded him gently. Trial basis, remember? Julian nodded slowly. But if this week goes well, and I think it will, we should discuss something more permanent. Something formal. After he left, I could still feel the weight of that conversation. This trial period wasn't just about whether Liam and I got along. It was about whether Julian could finally find someone who understood what his son needed. When our session ended and I started packing up, Liam grabbed my hand. Will you come back tomorrow? Please say yes. Absolutely, I promised him. But when I walked downstairs and headed for the front door, Marcus was waiting in the foyer. Arms crossed, expression sharp as cut glass, and his alpha pheromones were deliberately aggressive, a warning. Let's get something straight right now, he said, his voice low and cold. You're here for exactly 1 week. 7 days. Don't get comfortable in this house. Don't get attached to that boy. And absolutely do not think you have any place in Julian's life. Understand me. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice steady. I'm only here for Liam. That's all. Good. Remember that. He turned away, his heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. Because I'm going to be part of this family permanently. And you're completely replaceable. I walked out to my car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. My hands were shaking slightly, whether from anger or my omega instincts responding to an aggressive alpha. I couldn't tell. That night, I couldn't sleep. Liam's hopeful face kept appearing in my mind, the way he'd smiled when his father promised to take him to the park. In Julian's exhausted eyes, the vulnerability he'd shown for just a moment when talking about his struggles. This was supposed to be a simple job. 1 week, easy money, then move on. But I was already starting to realize it was going to be much more complicated than that. The next 4 days passed more smoothly than I'd anticipated. I watched Liam transform before my eyes. He started talking more, not just about art, but about everything. His favorite foods, the books he liked, stories about school. His paintings improved noticeably, not just in technical skill, but in confidence. He stopped apologizing for every brushstroke, stopped asking if things were good enough. He just created. Julian started showing up during our sessions more frequently. He never interrupted or tried to take over, just leaned against the door frame and observed quietly. At first it made me self-conscious, but eventually I got used to his presence. There was something almost peaceful about having him there, watching his son discover joy in something simple. And there was something else too. I couldn't stop noticing his scent. The way it shifted depending on his mood. When he was stressed, it was sharper, more acrid. When he was relaxed, which was rare, it mellowed into something almost sweet. And when he looked at me in a certain way, with that intense focus that made my skin prickle, his pheromones spiked in a way I couldn't quite interpret. I told myself it was nothing. He was an alpha. I was an omega. Biology was biology. It didn't mean anything. One afternoon, Liam created a portrait that made my breath catch. It was that house again, the tree, and 3 stick figures. When I asked who they were, Liam pointed to each one. This is me. This is Papa. Then his small finger moved to the 3rd figure. And this is you. My chest felt suddenly tight. I'd been in this house for less than a week, but this child had already included me in his definition of family. Later that evening, Julian found me in the kitchen. The housekeeper had left for the day, and the house was quiet again. Want some coffee? He offered. Sure. We sat at the counter together, and for a while neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt natural, like we'd known each other longer than just a few days. "The merger is almost finalized," Julian finally said. "Marcus's father's company and mine. The board members are pushing for the wedding to happen soon. They think it sends the right message to investors." I didn't know what to say to that. "I'm not going to lie to you about what this is," Julian continued, staring into his coffee cup. "It's an arrangement. A business decision disguised as a marriage. The board thinks Liam needs a stable, two-parent household, and the company benefits from the alliance." He paused, jaw working. "But Liam isn't happy. Marcus tolerates him at best. He doesn't mistreat him, but there's no warmth there. No real affection. What about you?" I asked carefully. "Are you happy with this arrangement?" Julian's laugh was bitter and short. "Happy? I honestly can't remember what that feels like anymore. I'm just surviving day to day, trying to keep the company running and give Liam some semblance of a normal childhood. I'm failing at both. If you're not happy, Liam won't be either," I said softly. "Kids are perceptive. They pick up on these things, even when we think we're hiding them." Julian's eyes met mine then. Deep brown and full of exhaustion, but something else too. A vulnerability he rarely showed. "I suspect you're different from most people I meet." "Different how?" "Most people see the CEO first. The money, the power, the status. They treat me like a business opportunity or a connection to exploit. But you..." He paused, searching for words. "You actually see me as just a person. A father trying his best and falling short. I'm not exactly in a position to judge anyone," I admitted honestly. "I'm barely keeping my head above water financially. My rent's overdue. I haven't had a real commission in months. And if you hadn't made this offer, I'd probably be moving back to my hometown by now." Completely defeated, Julian's lips twitched into something almost resembling a smile. "So we're both disasters, just in different ways." "Apparently so." We both laughed then, genuine laughter that seemed to surprise us both. And in that moment, something shifted between us. This wasn't just an employer-employee relationship anymore. It was becoming something else. Something neither of us had a name for yet. The peaceful moment ended when Marcus arrived, unannounced. He walked into the kitchen, and immediately his expression soured at seeing Julian and me sitting together like friends. "Julian, we need to finalize the seating chart for the gala," he said sharply. "I've been texting you all afternoon. I've been in meetings, Marcus." "It can wait." "No, it really can't. I'm already late for my dress fitting, and you still haven't confirmed the guest list. This is important." Julian sighed, the exhaustion returning to his features. "Fine. Let's go deal with it now." They left together, but not before Marcus shot me one more warning glance over his shoulder. That evening, Liam asked me to stay for dinner. "Please. It would make everything better if you were there." "Liam, I'm not really a guest here. I'm just your art teacher. Your family now," he said with such innocent certainty that it broke my heart a little. The word family hit me harder than I expected. Dinner was tense. Marcus barely participated in conversation. Julian was withdrawn and quiet, and Liam was trying desperately to fill the silence with excited chatter about his paintings. "My teacher said I'm getting really good," Liam announced, beaming. "He says I have natural talent." "That's nice, sweetie," Marcus replied mechanically, scrolling through his phone without looking up. "Marcus." Julian's voice was low, carrying a warning. "What?" "I'm listening." "No, you're not. You haven't looked at him once since we sat down." Marcus's fork clattered against his plate as he set it down hard. "Excuse me? I've spent all day planning this wedding, dealing with caterers and florists and seating arrangements. And now you're criticizing me for checking my phone. I'm asking you to be present, to actually engage with my son." "Our son," Marcus corrected sharply. "Or he will be once we're married. That's the whole point of this, isn't it? Giving him a complete family." A complete family means people who actually care about each other, Julian said calmly, but there was an edge to his voice. Not just people sharing a house. The silence that followed was suffocating. Liam's smile had completely faded. My instinct was to reach over and comfort him, but I didn't know if that was appropriate. This wasn't my family, despite what Liam had said earlier. Marcus stood up abruptly. "I'm done with this conversation." He stormed out, his alpha pheromones flaring with anger as he went. The scent was wrong, synthetic somehow, like he was wearing a patch to suppress his natural output. I'd heard about alphas who did that, who medicated themselves to appear more controlled, more civilized. It always struck me as deeply unnatural. Julian put his face in his hands for a moment, then looked at Liam. "I'm sorry, buddy. You shouldn't have to see us argue like that." "It's okay, Papa," Liam said quietly. But his eyes looked sad and much older than 7 years should. After dinner, Julian walked me to the door. We stood in the entryway, neither of us quite knowing what to say. "The trial week is almost over," Julian finally said. "Yeah, stay." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Make it official. Long term. Liam needs you." He paused, seeming to struggle with the next words. "And honestly, I think I do too." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. "Julian, I don't think." "Just think about it," he interrupted gently. "The offer stands. Sleep on it." I drove home with my mind racing, replaying everything that had happened. The trial week was ending, and I needed to decide. Walk away from this complicated situation, or stay and become part of something I didn't fully understand yet. But Liam's face kept appearing in my thoughts, along with Julian's tired eyes and quiet vulnerability. Maybe some complications were worth it. I said yes. The following Monday, I officially became Liam's tutor and caretaker. We signed a contract. The salary was set at a number that honestly made me feel like I'd won the lottery. And surprisingly, Julian gave me a studio room in the house where I could work on my own art projects. The room had excellent natural lighting, a large workspace, and shelves where I could store supplies. It felt surreal. Going from struggling to pay rent to having my own professional setup in a mansion. Marcus was obviously furious about the arrangements, though he didn't confront me directly at first. Instead, his behavior became passive-aggressive in ways that were impossible to ignore. Snide comments dropped during casual conversation. Cold shoulders whenever we passed in the hallway. And worst of all, he started questioning my credibility in front of Liam. One afternoon during lunch, the three of us were at the table when Marcus casually said, "You know, Liam, your teacher here was basically unemployed when your father found him." It was really quite charitable, taking him in like this. Liam looked confused, glancing between us. "But he's an artist. That's a real job." "Artist." Marcus actually made air quotes with his fingers. "That's just what people call themselves when they can't get actual employment. It's really quite sad." "Marcus, that's enough," Julian said sharply, setting down his fork with more force than necessary. "I'm simply being realistic about the situation. Someone needs to be." "No, you're being deliberately cruel to make yourself feel superior." Julian stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "This lunch is over." Marcus left in a huff, his departure punctuated by the sharp clicking of his heels. Liam turned to me with worried eyes that looked too old for his young face. "You are a real artist, right?" "A good one." "Yes, Liam," I assured him, though Marcus's words had stung more than I wanted to admit. "I'm an artist. That's what I've always been." "Good," Liam said, coming over to hug me tightly. "Because you're the best artist I know." Later that afternoon, Julian called me to his office. He was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the city with obvious frustration radiating from his posture. "I need to apologize," he said without turning around. "Marcus's behavior is completely unacceptable. I'm going to talk to him about boundaries." "He's your fiancé," I said carefully, not wanting to overstep. "His concerns about me being here are probably understandable from his perspective." There's a difference between having concerns and being intentionally hurtful. Julian finally turned to face me. And did you notice he didn't just attack you? He hurt Liam with those comments. That's what I can't forgive. Then why are you still planning to marry him? Julian's laugh was hollow and bitter. Because the board members expect it. Because it makes financial sense for both companies. Because I convinced myself that Liam needed a stable, two-parent household, even if it was built on a foundation of lies. He paused, rubbing his face tiredly. But watching Marcus treat him like an inconvenience, watching him dismiss the one person who's actually made him happy, I'm starting to question everything. What changed? I asked quietly. You did. Julian stepped closer, his voice dropping. In 1 week, you gave Liam more genuine affection and attention than Marcus has in 6 months. You see him as a person, not as an obligation or a burden. And that's made me realize what a real family should actually look like. The air between us felt charged with unspoken tension. His alpha pheromones were stronger now, less controlled. Wood smoke and leather, but underneath that, something darker. Something that made my omega hindbrain sit up and pay attention. I need to make a decision, Julian said slowly. And I want your honest opinion about it. My opinion. Why does what I think matter? Because you understand Liam in ways I'm still learning. And honestly, he took another step forward. You're starting to understand me, too. Better than most people ever have. My breathing became uneven. What kind of decision are we talking about? Breaking off the engagement. My heart stopped completely for several seconds. Julian, that's enormous. The company merger, the board expectations, the media coverage, everything you've been working toward. I know exactly what it means, he said firmly. But I can't keep my son in an environment where he feels unwelcome in his own home. And I can't keep pretending that a loveless arrangement is somehow better than being alone. He paused, studying my face. What do you think I should do? I thought about Liam's sad eyes at dinner. About the way Marcus had made air quotes when describing my profession. About the cold, sterile house that felt more like a museum than a home. I think, I said carefully, choosing each word with precision, that whatever is genuinely best for Liam should be your priority. Everything else is secondary to his well-being and happiness. Julian nodded slowly, his jaw setting with determination. You're absolutely right. That evening, Julian called Marcus for a conversation. I deliberately stayed in Liam's room, trying to give them privacy, but their voices carried through the house. They were loud enough that ignoring them was impossible. You cannot be serious right now. Marcus's scream echoed off the high ceilings. I'm completely serious. This engagement is over. We've invested months into planning this wedding. The board members are waiting for announcements. The media has already started covering our relationship. And you want to just throw it all away. I'll handle the board myself. I'll deal with the media fallout. But this decision is final and not up for debate. This is because of him, isn't it? Marcus's voice turned venomous. That struggling omega you brought into our home. You're actually choosing him over me. I'm choosing my son. I'm choosing Liam's happiness and emotional health. And yes, I'm also choosing someone who actually cares about what happens to him, rather than someone who sees him as an accessory to a business deal. Silence followed, heavy and thick. Then came the rapid clicking of Marcus's heels, followed by a door slamming so hard the whole house seemed to shake. Liam looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes. Is he gone now? For real. It looks that way. Good, Liam said softly, his relief obvious. I never liked him anyway. He always smelled like perfume that made my nose hurt. Julian entered the room, looking visibly drained, like he'd just run a marathon. Liam, can we talk for a minute? Liam nodded seriously. Julian knelt down to his son's level. Marcus and I aren't getting married. I know this might seem confusing, and if you have questions, I'll answer them honestly. But I need you to know that this decision is final. I'm actually happy about it, Papa, Liam said simply. Now we can be okay again. Right. He looked at me when he said it, including me in that definition of we. Julian and I exchanged a long look, and in that moment we both understood something profound. This relationship was complicated. It was unconventional. It was risky in ways neither of us could fully predict. But for Liam, it was exactly right. And maybe, just maybe, it was starting to feel right for us too. After Marcus left, a strange peace settled over the house. But outside its walls, the storm was brewing that we couldn't ignore. The media frenzy began almost immediately. CEO Julian Hawthorne breaks engagement, screamed from every headline. Reporters camped outside the property with cameras ready, waiting for someone to emerge. Julian's office was flooded with calls from concerned board members, nervous investors, and family members demanding explanations. But Julian remained surprisingly calm through all of it. Instead of hiding or making excuses, he started spending more time with Liam. They had breakfast together every morning, something that apparently never happened before. Julian started reading bedtime stories. On weekends, they actually went places together instead of Julian disappearing into his office. "Papa's different lately," Liam told me one afternoon while we were working on a watercolor painting. "He smiles more now. Like real smiles. Not the fake ones he used to do." "You seem happier too," I pointed out. "I am. Because now we're a real family." Liam's innocent certainty was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Papa, you and me. That's what families are supposed to be." The problem was that society didn't see it that way. Julian's parents arrived unannounced one afternoon. I was in my studio when I heard their voices carrying through the house, sophisticated and cold and clearly displeased. "What kind of madness is this, Julian?" His father's voice was authoritative, used to being obeyed. "You destroyed a perfectly advantageous match for what? For some poverty-stricken omega you picked up off the street?" "For Liam," Julian replied firmly. "And yes, for him as well. This is absolutely ridiculous. You're the CEO of Hawthorne Industries, responsible for the company's future and reputation. What message does this send to investors? To the board? My future is Liam. My responsibility is to my son's happiness. And if the company can't accept that, then I'll resign from my position." The silence that followed was deafening. "You're actually serious?" His mother's voice sounded shocked. "You'd throw away everything you've built?" Without hesitation. Their departure was swift and angry. But Julian seemed completely unfazed by their disapproval. That evening, the three of us ended up on the terrace. The city lights shimmered below us. The breeze was cool and pleasant, and for a brief moment everything felt peaceful despite the chaos surrounding us. "Will you always stay here with us?" Liam asked sleepily, leaning against my side. My throat tightened before I could answer. "I want him to," Julian said suddenly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. "I want you to stay. Not as an employee anymore. Not as just Liam's teacher, but as something more permanent." He was searching for the right words, struggling to articulate something that felt too big for simple language. "As family," I offered quietly. "Exactly. As family." My heart was racing, so fast I thought it might burst. "Julian, this is so much more complicated than you're making it sound. What will society say? How will the media react? What about the impact on your business and reputation? I honestly don't care anymore." Julian's voice was firm. "For the past year, I've been living for other people. For board members and investors and family expectations. But now I want to live for myself. I want to live for Liam." He reached out and took my hand. "And I want to live with you as part of our lives." My breath came out shaky. "I'm terrified." "So am I." His thumb traced circles on the back of my hand. "But doesn't that fear make it more real? More worth fighting for?" Liam had fallen asleep between us, peaceful and innocent. We both looked at him, then at each other, and something unspoken passed between us. "So what do you say?" Julian whispered. "Will you stay? Really stay? As part of this family we're building?" I thought about all the risks, all the potential complications and consequences. But then I looked at Liam's peaceful face and Julian's hopeful eyes. And the answer became yes. I'll stay, I finally said. Julian squeezed my hand, and in that moment on the terrace, beneath the city lights, with a sleeping child between us, we made a silent promise to each other. This was unconventional. This was risky and uncertain. But it was ours, and that made it worth everything. The following weeks brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. Julian held a press conference where he addressed the broken engagement directly. He stood confident and unapologetic, explaining that he wanted to live authentically, that Liam was his priority, and that his family structure might be unconventional, but it was his choice to make. The media response was divided sharply. Some outlets were supportive, especially younger journalists and progressive publications. Others were harshly critical, questioning his judgment and fitness as a CEO. But surprisingly, most people seemed understanding, particularly those with their own non-traditional families. Liam faced difficulties at school initially. Some children teased him with the casual cruelty that kids are capable of. "Your dad's weird," they said. "You don't have a normal family." But Liam proved to be braver than any of us expected. He came home one day and told me. I told him my papa loves me, and you love me, and that's literally all that matters in the whole world. His courage moved me to tears. Julian and I remained cautious in public, maintaining professional boundaries. But privately, we were slowly building something that resembled a real partnership. We made parenting decisions together, attended Liam's school events as a unified presence, and honestly, it felt natural in a way that surprised both of us. And then my heat hit. I've been so focused on everything else, on Liam, on Julian, on the chaos of our new life, that I'd completely lost track of my cycle. It started as a dull ache in my lower belly, a warmth that spread through my limbs and made my skin hypersensitive. I was in my studio working on a new painting when the first wave hit me. I dropped my brush. The scent hit me a second later, my own pheromones flooding the room, sweet and desperate and unmistakably omega in heat. I'd been on suppressants for years, but with everything that had happened, I let my prescription lapse. And now, at the worst possible moment, my body was betraying me. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere away from. The door opened. Julian stood there, and I watched his pupils dilate as my scent hit him. His alpha instincts would be screaming right now, his body responding to the chemical signal that an omega in heat was nearby. "Eli." His voice was rough, strained. "You're in heat." "I know." I was already backing away, my body screaming at me to move closer even as my mind demanded distance. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize I'll go. I'll get out of the house. I'll find somewhere." "No." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Julian, you can't be in here. You're alpha." My alpha is under control. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. I could see him fighting his own instincts, could smell the effort it was taking for him not to close the distance between us. "But I'm not letting you leave like this. You're in no condition to drive. And God knows what would happen if you went somewhere alone. I'll be fine. I've handled heats before. Alone." I didn't answer. Julian's expression softened, just slightly. "Eli, I'm not going to touch you. Not unless you ask me to. But I'm not leaving you alone in this state either." The second wave hit, harder than the first. My knees buckled, and Julian caught me before I could hit the floor. His arms were warm around me. His scent, wood smoke and leather, and that dark, intoxicating undertone, wrapped around me like a blanket. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to press closer, to let him take care of me, to let him. "Eli." His voice was a growl now, barely controlled. "Tell me what you need." I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't admit what I actually wanted. "The truth," he said. "I need you to tell me the truth." I looked up at him, at those dark brown eyes that had seen so much exhaustion and pain and hope. At the alpha who had chosen his son over a business deal, who had chosen authenticity over comfort, who had chosen me. You, I whispered. I need you. That was all it took. His mouth was on mine before I could draw another breath. Kissing Julian Hawthorne was nothing like I'd imagined. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry, years of restraint breaking all at once. His hands fisted in my hair, tilting my head back, and I made a sound that was half moan, half whimper. Tell me again, he said against my lips. Tell me you want this. I want this. I want you. Julian, please. He lifted me onto the work table, knocking aside paintbrushes and canvases without seeming to notice. My legs wrapped around his waist automatically, pulling him closer, and the feel of his body against mine sent a jolt of pure heat through my veins. Your scent, he groaned, burying his face in my neck. God, Eli. I've been trying so hard to ignore it, to keep my distance. But every time I'm near you, every time I catch even a hint of you, I know. My fingers were shaking as I tugged at his shirt, desperate to feel skin against skin. I know I felt it too. I just didn't think. Didn't think what? Didn't think you'd want me. Not really. Not like this. Julian pulled back just enough to look at me, and the expression on his face made my chest ache. Eli. His voice was rough with emotion. You're the first person in years who's made me feel like a person instead of a CEO. You're the reason my son smiles again. You're the reason I wake up in the morning and don't dread the day ahead. He cupped my face in his hands, thumbs brushing my cheekbones. I want you. Not because of your heat. Not because of biology. Because you're you. Because you're kind and talented and you see me. The real me. The one I've been hiding from everyone for so long, I almost forgot he existed. I kissed him again because I didn't have words for what I was feeling. Because the only way I could express it was with my body, with my hands, with the desperate press of my mouth against his. We undressed each other slowly, then not slowly at all, until there was nothing between us but skin and want and the overwhelming sin of alpha and omega intertwining. When he finally entered me, I cried out, not in pain, but in relief, in completion, in the feeling of something slotting into place that I hadn't even known was missing. Eli. His forehead pressed against mine, both of us breathing hard. Eli, I know. I wrapped my arms around his neck, holding him close. I know. We moved together like we've been doing this for years instead of minutes. Like our bodies had been designed for each other. Every stroke, every touch, every sound he pulled from my lips felt inevitable. Felt like coming home. When the peak came, it crashed over both of us like a wave. I felt him tense, felt his knot swell inside me, locking us together in the most intimate way possible. And then his teeth were at my neck. May I, he asked, his voice barely human. Please, Eli, let me mark you. Let me make you mine. My omega hindbrain was screaming, yes, yes, yes. But it wasn't just instinct. It was him. It was Julian, who had trusted me with his son, who had shown me his vulnerability, who had chosen me when it would have been easier to choose anything else. Yes, I said. Mark me. Claim me. I'm yours. His teeth sank into the soft flesh where my neck met my shoulder, and the pain was sharp for just a moment before it blossomed into something else entirely. Something warm and golden and permanent. I felt the bond snap into place like a lock clicking shut. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges we faced, whatever the world threw at us, we would face it together. I woke up slowly, warmth enveloping me from all sides. Julian's arm was draped over my waist, his chest pressed against my back, his breath warm against my marked neck. The bond thrummed between us like a second heartbeat. I could feel him, not his thoughts exactly, but his emotions. Contentment. Protectiveness. And underneath that, a thread of anxiety. He was afraid I'd regret it. Julian, I said softly. His arm tightened around me. You're awake. I'm awake. I turned in his arms to face him, and his eyes were already open, watching me with that intense focus that always made my skin prickle. Last night, he started. I don't regret it. I said before he could finish. Not for a second. Relief flooded through the bond, so strong it almost made me dizzy. I should have asked you properly, he said. Before. Not in the middle of. Julian. I pressed a finger to his lips. I've been falling for you since the day you hired me. Probably before that, honestly. From the moment I saw the way you looked at Liam. Like he was the most important thing in your world. He is. Julian's hand came up to cup my face. And so are you. You and Liam. You're my whole world now. There was a knock at the door. Papa? Eli? Are you in there? Liam's voice made us both freeze. We'll be right out, buddy, Julian called, his voice remarkably steady considering the situation. Okay. The housekeeper made pancakes. We listened to his footsteps retreat down the hallway, then both exhaled at the same time. So, I said, we're going to have to explain this to a 7-year-old. Julian groaned, burying his face in my hair. I'm not prepared for this conversation. We'll figure it out, I said, running my fingers through his dark hair. Together. Remember? He lifted his head to look at me, and the smile that spread across his face was different from any I'd seen before. Softer. More open. More real. Together, he agreed. Breakfast was awkward in a way I hadn't anticipated. Liam was too observant for his age. He kept looking between Julian and me with a puzzled expression, like he was trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. Papa, he finally said, why does Eli smell like you? Julian choked on his coffee. I felt my face flush. Out of the mouths of babes. That's... Julian cleared his throat. That's something we need to talk about, buddy. Are you bonded now? Liam asked, completely matter of fact. Like, permanently. Because Marcus used to talk about that. He said alphas and omegas bond when they're in love, and that it smells different after. I stared at him, speechless. 7 years old, and he already understood more than some adults I knew. Yes, Julian said quietly. We're bonded. Permanently. Liam considered this for a moment, chewing his pancake thoughtfully. Okay, he said finally. Does that mean Eli is going to live with us forever? Yes, Julian said again, and this time his voice was firm. Certain. Liam's face broke into a wide grin. Good. I told you he was family. And just like that, the conversation was over. Liam went back to his pancakes, apparently satisfied with the explanation, leaving Julian and me to stare at each other in stunned silence. He really is something else, I said. He really is. Julian's hand found mine under the table. He gets it from his father. His Omega father. Julian's expression flickered. I haven't talked much about him. It's complicated. You don't have to, I said quickly. Not until you're ready. Thank you. He squeezed my hand. For understanding, one Saturday, Liam had a school play where he'd landed the lead role. He was terrified, convinced he would freeze on stage and forget every line. I can't do this, he said tearfully the morning of the performance. Everyone will laugh at me. Liam, Julian said gently, kneeling to his level. Do you remember the first time you tried painting? You were scared then, too. But you did it anyway. And look at the amazing art you create now. But this is different from painting. Not really, I added. Art and acting are both about expressing yourself authentically. And you're one of the bravest people I know, Liam. He sniffled, wiping his eyes. You'll both be there watching. Promise. Front row center, Julian promised without hesitation. The play was phenomenal. Liam delivered his lines with confidence, moved across the stage naturally, and when he took his final bow and spotted us in the audience, his smile was so radiant that my chest physically ached with pride. Afterward, we went for ice cream to celebrate. Liam was chattering excitedly about the performance when he casually dropped a bombshell. My teacher asked me today if you're my other dad. I actually choked on my ice cream. Julian's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. What did you tell her? I said you're my uncle technically, but basically you're my dad too. Liam shrugged, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She smiled and said it's wonderful that I have two people who love me so much. Julian and I looked at each other across the table, and in that moment the labels suddenly didn't matter anymore. Uncle, father, partner. Whatever we were called, we were present for Liam. And that was what truly counted. The following months brought challenges. But they were beautiful challenges that we faced together. Julian officially addressed the media with complete transparency. He stood before cameras and reporters and announced that he intended to live his personal life authentically, that Liam would always be his first priority, and that while his family structure was unconventional, it was his choice to make as a father and as a person. The media remained divided in their responses. Some journalists were supportive and praised his honesty. Others questioned his judgment harshly, writing critical pieces about his fitness as a CEO and role model. But surprisingly, the majority of public response leaned understanding, especially from younger generations and people living in progressive communities. Liam struggled at school initially, facing the kind of casual cruelty that children can inflict without fully understanding the impact. Kids whispered behind his back and made comments designed to hurt. "Your family's strange," they said. "That's not how normal people live." But Liam demonstrated remarkable courage that honestly inspired me. One evening, he came home and recounted his response to the bullies. "I told them my papa loves me completely, and my other dad cares about me deeply, and that matters infinitely more than their narrow opinions about what families should look like." His strength and conviction moved me emotionally in ways I struggled to express. Julian and I maintained professional boundaries in public settings, conscious of how our relationship might be perceived or misconstrued. But privately, we were building a genuine partnership that went beyond the original arrangement. We collaborated on parenting decisions, attended Liam's school functions together, discussed his education and emotional development. And honestly, it all felt surprisingly natural. Several months later, Liam's birthday arrived. Instead of requesting an elaborate party like previous years, he made a simple request. "Can we go to that park? The one with an enormous oak tree. The one I always painted." The three of us went together. Just us. No elaborate plans or fancy arrangements. Liam played on the swings, laughing with pure joy, while Julian and I sat on a nearby bench watching him. "I need to thank you," Julian said softly. "For what specifically?" "For taking a chance that day when Liam ran to you. You could have walked away from this complicated situation. Most people would have." He turned to look at me directly. "But you stayed. And by staying, you saved both of us." "I didn't save anyone. I just showed up." "Showing up is everything." Julian's hand found mine, our fingers intertwining naturally. "You transformed us into an actual family." Liam ran over to us, sweaty and glowing with happiness. "I want a picture." All three of us together. A passing jogger kindly agreed to take the photo. We posed together, Liam positioned between us, all three of us smiling genuinely. The photo wasn't professionally composed or perfectly lit. It was simple, slightly imperfect, and completely real. When we returned home, Liam immediately printed the photo and framed it himself, displaying it proudly on his desk among his favorite paintings. That night, after Liam fell asleep, Julian and I found ourselves on the terrace again. It had become our habitual spot, the place where important conversations happened naturally. "Did you ever imagine your life would look like this?" I asked quietly. "Never in my wildest imagination," Julian admitted honestly. "But I genuinely wouldn't change anything about it now." Neither would I. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights shimmer below us. Then Julian spoke again, his voice carrying emotion he didn't try to hide. "Liam told me something yesterday that I need to share with you." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Papa, I'm literally the luckiest kid who ever existed because I have two dads who actually care about me deeply.'" Julian's voice cracked slightly. "Two dads. He's completely accepted you. Not as a teacher or an uncle or anything temporary. As his father." My throat tightened painfully. "Julie and I." He turned to face me fully. "Whatever this relationship is between us, whether we call it partnership or friendship or something more complex, I accept it completely. I want it permanently. So do I whispered. Julian took my hand again, our fingers threading together naturally, and we stood there together on the terrace as the city lights witnessed our unspoken promises. The future remained uncertain, but filled with hope. Because yes, this was risky. Yes, it was complicated and unconventional. But it was also real. It was honest. It was genuinely ours. And for Liam, for Julian, for myself, for this family we'd somehow created together, it was absolutely perfect. Exactly as it was. Epilogue. 1 year later. The gallery opening was packed. I stood in the corner, watching strangers admire my paintings, and tried not to cry. A year ago, I'd been selling sunset landscapes for $50 on a sidewalk, 1 week away from homelessness. Now I had my first solo exhibition at a respectable gallery, and every single piece had already sold. You did it. Julian's hand found the small of my back warm and grounding. He was wearing a charcoal suit tonight, his dark hair perfectly styled, and the bond between us hummed with pride and affection. We did it, I corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Yes, you could have. You're talented. You would have found a way eventually. He pressed a kiss to my temple. I just helped speed up the process. Papa. Eli. Liam came running toward us, still wearing his school uniform because he'd insisted on coming straight from class. His face was flushed with excitement. Your paintings are so pretty. Can I have the one with the sunset? The orange and purple one. I want it for my room. I laughed, kneeling down to his level. That one's already sold, buddy. But I'll paint you a new one. Any colors you want. Really? Promise. Promise. Liam threw his arms around my neck, hugging me tightly, and I held him close. My heart felt so full I thought it might burst. Julian's hand rested on my shoulder, and when I looked up at him, his eyes were soft in a way that was reserved for moments like this. Moments when the three of us were together, when everything else faded away, and all that was left was love. I love you, he said quietly. Both to me and to Liam. A statement of fact, as undeniable as gravity. I love you too, I said back. Love you both, Liam added, his voice muffled against my shoulder. The gallery buzzed around us, strangers admiring art, champagne glasses clinking, conversations flowing. But in that small bubble, it was just the three of us. The CEO who'd been trapped in a gilded cage. The son who'd run from a future he couldn't accept. And the artist who'd shown them both what freedom looked like. We weren't a traditional family. We didn't fit into anyone's neat categories or expectations. But we were real. We were honest. We were ours. And that made it absolutely perfect. A wedding epilogue. The morning of the wedding, I woke up alone. Not in the bad way. Julian's side of the bed was still warm, his scent still clinging to the pillows. Wood smoke and cedar wrapped around me like a second skin. But he wasn't there. And through the bond, I could feel him. Nervous. Julian Hawthorne, the man who had stared down boardrooms and media firestorms and his own parents' disapproval, was nervous about marrying me. I smiled into the pillow and let myself float in the warmth of it for a moment. 3 years ago, I'd been selling paintings on a sidewalk, 1 week away from homelessness. 2 years ago, I'd been marked and claimed by an alpha I was still learning to trust. 1 year ago, he'd gotten down on one knee in front of Liam's school play, right there in the auditorium while parents and teachers and children looked on, and asked me to make it official. Now it was happening. A soft knock at the bedroom door pulled me from my thoughts. Eli? You awake? Liam's voice, older now at 10, more confident than the terrified little boy who'd grabbed my leg on that street corner. I could hear the excitement bubbling underneath. Come in, buddy. The door swung open, and Liam bounded in, already dressed in his little suit, dark blue, matching Julian's tie. His hair had been tamed somewhat, though a curl still escaped over his forehead. He was growing so fast I could barely keep up. Already up to my shoulder. Already talking about middle school and art camp, and whether he wanted to try out for the soccer team. Papa said I'm supposed to give you this. He thrust a small box into my hands, wrapped in simple brown paper with a sprig of lavender tied around it. He said it's something old and something borrowed, but I don't get which one it is. I turn the box over in my hands, my heart already racing. Maybe it's both. Open it. I pulled the string, let the paper fall away, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a silver cuff bracelet, simple and elegant, with an inscription on the inside. I had to tilt it toward the light to read the words. You showed up. That was everything. My throat tightened. It was a callback to our conversation on the park bench, the one where I told Julian that all I'd done was show up. He'd never let me forget it. Can I help you put it on? Liam asked, practically vibrating with impatience. I held out my wrist, and Liam carefully fastened the clasp, his small fingers surprisingly nimble. When he was done, he stepped back to admire his work. It looks good, he announced. Papa has good taste. Your papa has excellent taste. I agreed, turning my wrist to watch the light catch the silver. That's why he chose me. Liam wrinkled his nose. That's gross. Your grossness is my romance. I'm telling Papa you said that. You do that. He laughed and ran out of the room, already shouting for Julian down the hallway. I sat there for a moment longer, touching the bracelet, feeling the cool metal warm against my skin. Something old. Something borrowed. Something that meant forever. The venue was a garden, not one of the cold, architectural spaces that Julian's former life had been filled with, but a real garden. Wildflowers growing in organized chaos, a stone path leading to an arch covered in climbing roses, and beneath it, a small gathering of the people who actually mattered. Not the board members. Not the investors. Not the press. Just us. Liam stood at the altar already, holding something in his hands that I couldn't quite see from the path. The housekeeper who had been kind to me on my first day sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. A few of Julian's actual friends, not business associates, but real friends, occupied the other seats. And beside the arch, waiting, was Julian. He looked like something out of a painting I would have been too afraid to attempt 3 years ago. Dark suit, perfectly tailored. White shirt open at the collar, no tie. His dark hair was slightly windswept, and his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had looked so exhausted the day we met, were bright with something that made my chest ache. Through the bond, I felt it all. Love, yes. Devotion, absolutely. But underneath that, a quiet, profound gratitude. As if he still couldn't believe this was real. I walked down the path alone. No one to give me away. I never needed that. When I reached the arch, Julian took my hands, and Liam stepped forward, holding up what he'd been carrying. It was a painting. Small, a little messy around the edges, clearly done by a 10-year-old hand. 3 figures beneath a tree, one tall, one medium, one small. The sun was a giant orange blob in the corner, the colors bleeding together in a way that would have made an art critic wince. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I made it for your wedding, Liam said, his voice wobbling just slightly. Because you're a family. And families need art. I felt the tears start to fall before I could stop them. Julian pulled Liam into a one-armed hug, and Liam protested. Papa, you're going to mess up my suit. But he was laughing, and I was laughing, and somehow we all ended up in a group hug beneath the rose-covered arch. The officiant, a beta woman with kind eyes and a gentle scent of rain, smiled at us. Should I come back in 5 minutes? No, Julian said, his voice rough. This is perfect. Don't change a thing. The ceremony was short. We'd agreed on that. No long speeches, no performative declarations. Just the important parts. Julian, the officiant began, do you take Eli to be your bonded partner, your husband, your home? Julian turned to face me fully, still holding my hands. His thumbs traced circles on my knuckles, a nervous habit I discovered in our first year together, one he only showed when he was truly vulnerable. I take him, Julian said, not because I need him, but because every day since he walked into my life, I've chosen him. And I want to keep choosing him for the rest of my life. Liam sniffled loudly from his position beside the arch, still clutching his painting. And Eli, the officiant, continued, Do you take Julian to be your bonded partner, your husband, your home? I looked at Julian, really looked at him. At the alpha who had been trapped in a life he never wanted, who had broken free not for himself but for his son, who had let me in when every instinct told him to keep the walls up. I take him, I said, because he showed me that family isn't about biology or tradition or what anyone else thinks. It's about showing up. Every single day. And he's never stopped showing up for me. For us. Julian made a sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. You're going to make me cry in front of everyone. Good, I said. I want witnesses. The officiant smiled. Then by the power vested in me by the state and by the bond you've already forged, I pronounce you married. You may. Julian kissed me before she could finish. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't chaste or appropriate for a wedding ceremony. It was the kind of kiss that said, I've been waiting for this. I've been patient, but my patience has officially run out. His hand cupped the back of my neck, thumb brushing over the scar where he'd marked me 2 years ago, and through the bond one felt his alpha purr with satisfaction. Mine, the bond said. Finally. Officially. Mine. Yours, I sent back. Always have been. Leah made a gagging noise. Gross. I changed my mind. This is disgusting. But he was grinning when we pulled apart, his painting held triumphantly above his head like a trophy. Picture time, he announced. Everyone together. I'm going to hang it in my room. The small crowd laughed. Someone produced the camera. We posed beneath the rose-covered arch, Julian on one side, me on the other, Liam in the middle, holding his painting up like a shield against the world. And when the camera flashed, I knew. This was what happiness felt like. Not the absence of struggle or fear or uncertainty, but the presence of something bigger than all of those things. Love, family, home. The reception was in the garden too. Long tables covered in wildflowers and candles and food that the housekeeper had insisted on making herself. None of that catering nonsense she'd said when we tried to hire someone. A wedding needs real food. Food made with love. So we ate her cooking, roasted vegetables and fresh bread and a cake that Liam had decorated himself, frosting smeared in happy, uneven layers, and we laughed, and we talked, and for a few hours, the world outside didn't exist. Julian's parents hadn't come. We'd invited them, but they declined. Maybe someday they'd come around. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, it didn't matter. We had the family we'd chosen. Liam fell asleep before dessert, his head in my lap, his painting still clutched to his chest. I ran my fingers through his hair and looked across the table at Julian, who was watching us both with an expression I'd learned to recognize over the years. Gratitude, wonder, and underneath it all, a quiet, fierce protectiveness. I love you, he said, not for the first time today, but like it still surprised him to say it. I love you too, I said back. And I love that he called you his other dad, Julian added, nodding toward the sleeping Liam. Even before the wedding. Even before any of this was official. He knew. Kids know things, I said. They see what's real. Julian reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were warm, calloused from years of signing documents and building empires, but gentle against my skin. Thank you, he said. For what? For running toward him that day. When Liam screamed. When he grabbed your leg. You could have pushed him away. You could have called the police. You could have done anything else. But you didn't. You ran toward him. I thought about that afternoon. The brush slipping from my fingers. The terrified little boy crouched behind my paintings. The desperate hope in his eyes. I ran toward you too, Julian continued quietly. Not that day. I was too scared. Too trapped in my own life. But eventually, I ran toward you. And I've never stopped. The candles flickered between us. The garden was quiet now, the other guests having drifted off to find champagne, or fresh air, or quiet corners to talk. Do you think we'll make it? I asked. Like, really make it? Through everything. Julian's hand tightened around mine. We already have, he said. Everything else is just details. Later that night, after Liam had been carried to bed, after the guest had gone home, after the candles had burned down to nothing but wax and memory, Julian and I stood on the terrace of the house that had become our home. The city lights shimmer below us, same as they had that first night we'd admitted something was growing between us. Same as they had when Julian had asked me to stay. Same as they had when we told Liam that our family was real, no matter what anyone said. You know, Julian said, wrapping his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder, I used to hate this terrace. Why? Because I'd stand out here alone. Before you. And I'd look at the city and think about how I had everything anyone could want, money, power, status, and still feel like I had nothing. And now, his lips brushed my marked neck, sending a shiver down my spine. Now I stand out here and think about how I have everything that actually matters. And none of it is things. I leaned back against him, letting his warmth surround me. Through the bond, I felt his contentment, his peace, his quiet joy. What are you thinking about? He asked. I turned in his arms so I could see his face, so I could look into those dark brown eyes that had once been so exhausted and were now so full of light. I'm thinking, I said, that I'm glad Liam ran toward me that day. Julian smiled, that rare, real smile that he saved for moments like this. So am I, he said. So am I. And beneath the city lights, with the bond humming between us and our son sleeping safely inside, Julian kissed me again. Not because we were married now. Not because it was expected. But because some stories don't end with the last page. Some stories just keep going. And this one was just beginning. The end.